Awede, welcome to Born Extinct, my journey to acknowledgement of my ancestors and authentic spiritual self. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct. This period of COVID-19 is a stark reminder to the Indigenous people of a time when they were severely affected by European diseases. Shortly after the arrival of the invader, scores of natives died from diseases which thrived in dense semi-urban populations, diseases common and treatable in Europe. Not much is being said about the steady decline of the Khoi and the San populations between 1652 and 1990. There seems to be a blanket acceptance that the Khoi and the San became extinct due to the deadly smallpox epidemics of 1713 and 1755. The inability to access their most basic but essential needs, the land and the medicines growing on their lands, is what frustrated their ability to heal. The denialist narrative suggests that 20% of Khoi and San perished in 1713 and 5% in 1755. There's no mention of the genocides. As there were no clear census or interest in Aboriginal populations, the pre-colonial population remains in dispute. The impact of Khoi and San groups have been dismissed and ignored by European historians. The myth that the Khoi and the San willingly gave up their lives and their lifestyles and their land for a few shiny objects and trinkets and alcohol is a convenient myth only for the European, while for the victims it caused untold misery. Mostly, the population of Khoi and San at any time was calculated on their ability to subsist while their country was being stolen. The Indigenous people, with no concept of hunger or greed, grappled with toxic capitalism brought to their land by the barbaric invader. Indigenous people suffer from higher rates of chronic conditions that put them at higher risk of COVID-19. Indigenous concepts of health are anchored in 4 elements of wellness: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. A recent study suggests that European diseases have molded the immune systems of nations who suffer collective trauma. From early colonization, Indigenous groups were chronically impacted by diseases including measles, smallpox, scarlet fever, chickenpox, yellow fever, whooping cough, illnesses associated with famine, oppression, poverty, and violence. There are widely varying estimations of how many Indigenous people were in the Cape. Evidence shows that there were millions. In 1837, at the request of the Crown, 200 years after the imposition of the European on my people, a report called the Report of the Parliament Select Committee on Aboriginal Tribes was requested by the British Crown. This report estimates that the population of the Khoi could not have been less than 200,000 in 1652. Long before the arrival of smallpox, the Aboriginals have already fought 3 major Khoi Dutch wars, and Indigenous nations were fragmented and scattered all over the Cape and further north. Smallpox is a virus which enters the body through the nose and throat, spreads through the lungs where it mutates and spreads to the lymphatic systems. Before the arrival of smallpox, there were no such diseases. It is widely accepted that a ship arriving in the colony on 13 February 1713 brought with it a sailor infected with smallpox. The ship's laundry was taken to the slave quarters and washed in a river, which caused the water to be contaminated. Smallpox continued its destruction after 1730 as the Khoi fled further inland, causing great disruption amongst Aboriginal people all the way to what is called Namibia today. A visitor to the colony, Francois Valentine, reported in 1713 seeing Khoi and son lying dying by the hundreds along the road as they tried to flee the Cape with all their belongings, including cattle and huts, accusing the Dutch of bewitching them. This resulted in a complete loss of labor for the settler, and this frustrated them. It is unclear how the Khoi and son managed and the measures taken to survive. Still today, the mention of smallpox make our elders shudder. Medicines from Europe and Batavia, although mostly inaccessible to indigenous people, were for the treatment of the settler, but this gave them no relief. They continued to infect everybody they came into contact with. Within 20 years, the Dutch settlers' refreshment station had grown, claiming property hundreds of miles inland, and the settlers raided farms for livestock and manpower, cattle grazing, crop planting, depriving the indigenous people of land and water. By the time historians, anthropologists, astronomers, priests, and adventurers arrived at the Cape, the colonial project was at an advanced stage. Smallpox was completely foreign to the natives, who were completely competent at healing all indigenous illnesses. Until the time they started dying, there had been no study or plant medicines for the treatment or cure of smallpox. Reports suggest that 144 of the 2,000 Europeans at the Cape died in the 1713 epidemic, while a quarter of approximately 400 slaves living in abysmal conditions died. But they were hastily replaced. It is, however, convenient to maintain the narrative that there were only few hunter-gatherers and nomadic groups in South Africa when colonization arrived in the Cape. The ultimate goal of both the Dutch and the British was ethnic cleansing and to occupy this land by any means possible and to create a little Europe in Africa. Among my peers in the indigenous community, I found an increasing fear and suspicion of contamination and harm by people of European descent. This is understandable as we carry ancestral memories of trauma. The cultural mistrust that the indigenous people feel about all things Western, including government, medical service, etc., is legitimate, while health workers are still the product of colonial culture. This can easily be resolved by the training of indigenous healthcare professionals. In spite of all the challenges, indigenous people are resilient and strive for wellness based on indigenous knowledge. In South Africa, despite so much fear of pandemics and poor access to health facilities, COVID-19 has not affected indigenous people disproportionately. Kaigangs for your time, Cape of Storm, Table Bay, Falls Bay, Cape of Good Hope, settler, it was not yours to take. I am a Takwa, and I was born extinct.